Thank you. First, I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to this debate as part of your decision-making process in this critical election. Thank you also to the DAY and the Eastern Connecticut Chamber of Commerce for sponsoring the debate, and the League of Women Voters for assisting in that effort. My name is Mike France. For the past 3 years, I've had the honor of serving the residents of Ledyard as a town councilor and the chair of the Finance Committee. In that time, I've worked diligently to engage directly with the residents of Ledyard and be responsive to their issues and concerns. As your state representative, I will do the same. As I travel around the 42nd District, the almost universal concern expressed by our residents are taxes and the high cost of living, or jobs in the economy, or both. What we have seen over the last 2 years is a continuation of the out-of-control spending of the state legislature. The result is a state government that costs more than the residents can afford. The evidence of this is retirees leaving the state, families planning to leave the state as soon as their last child graduates from high school, and our college graduates having to leave the state to find decent employment where they can afford to raise a family. We need to change the direction of our state. This starts with balancing the budget without increasing tax revenue or borrowing to pay current expenses, and removing the burden of excessive regulation on small business. The residents of the 42nd District deserve better from their legislature. I look forward to the opportunity to answer your question tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Representative Bowles.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I likewise thank all of you for turning out this evening. I too want to thank Paul and the New London Day, the Eastern Chamber of Commerce, and the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this particular event. I think it's very healthy for us to be in front of you, both candidates, to offer you the choice in this election. I think there are major differences between our philosophies and our policy structures around the future of the state of Connecticut. I feel particularly fortunate that we're here within a very close radius of where my young children went to school on this site, where I was an emergency medical technician many years ago up at the Preston City Firehouse, where I have been an active member of the Preston City Congregational Church, and just live up the road, a few miles. My wife and I have a farm up there, Zion Hill Farm. I've been living in this area for 40 years. I've gotten to know Ledyard and Montville as well in my 2 years as a state representative, and really am fortunate to represent all of you and the entire district. There are 3 points, hopefully, that I'll be able to cover during the course of this debate. One, I believe in making government more efficient and cost-effective. I also want to be a major advocate for local job creation and provide regional economic development, and then also continue my advocacy for local agriculture, local clean energy, and local tourism.
All right,
thank you very much.
Thank you. So we'll start with our first question, and before we get to the audience question, sort of a general look at where we are 2 years after the last time we got together for an election, and this is starting with Mr. France. At that time, the state was looking at a record deficit situation, and in the interim, we saw the steps that were taken to address the deficit. We saw the passage of a major education bill, and then in the wake of the Newtown tragedy, the passage of what's considered the strongest gun legislation in the country. So, Mr. France, just kind of looking back 2 years, how do you assess where the state is it right now, and how it's addressed its problems, and what direction would you have perhaps taken differently, Mr. France?
Well, thank you. I think it's good to reflect on how we've gotten to this point. Certainly over the last 2 years, we've seen some progress. The challenge is if you measure it against other states, even in the region, we're lagging behind them. We saw Governor Malloy complained about coming in with a $3.4 billion deficit. Said he wouldn't raise taxes, and the first thing he does is have a $1.8 billion tax increase. And what do we find ourselves looking at now? A $2.9 billion deficit in the next biennial. So we didn't gain very much, and we took a lot of money out of people's pockets. And when you do that, you affect the economy. You affect job creation. You affect small business. I think those are the keys that have not been dealt with well over the last 2 years. We essentially find ourselves almost in the same place we were 2 years ago fiscally. We're still lagging at the bottom of all 50 states in almost all meaningful economic indicators, about the same place we were 2 years ago. And we spent a lot of money in the interim that hasn't really gotten us very far down the road.
Thank you. And just point out to our candidates, the timekeepers are directly in front of you, and periodically they'll be showing you how much time you have left out of your 24 minutes. Representative Bowles, if you can kind of assess the job you think has been done since 2 years ago when you guys sat down to debate.
I do have to agree that we can do much better here in the state. And one of the reasons I'm running for re-election is that I want to continue the work that I've been doing up in Hartford for all of you on behalf of this district, to continue initiatives specifically around regional efforts that we have. We were able to go ahead, and I was privileged to be appointed by House Speaker Brendan Sharkey to chair the Regional Entities Working Group of the Moore Commission, which is the Municipal Opportunities and Regional Efficiencies Commission, to really go ahead and decentralize both our funding and some of the policy decisions back down to local government through the Council of Governments. We were able to go ahead and comprehensively reduce the size of the number of Council of Governments from 14 to 9, effective this past July. I was successful in going ahead and effective January of 2015, under the auspices of the 9 regional Council of Governments, we will have regional human services coordinating councils. I think for a small state, we are very fractured. I think we remain largely inefficient in a lot of the ways that we deliver services. So I'm committed to working very hard in terms of addressing those issues. The first thing that I would do, and what I'm calling for, is a legislative commission to go ahead and take a look at 3 key areas. This legislative commission would be charged with streamlining the legislative and electoral process. I am proposing that we extend or have a discussion and debate about extending the terms of office for state representatives from 2 to 4 years. I also believe in term limits. 15 states across the country currently have term limits, and I believe the time is right for us to discuss this. We have not made any changes in our Constitution relative to the state legislature since 1884. That's 130 years. I think the time is right to do that. So I think if we begin to look at the House of Representatives and do the job first, the other thing is I'm proposing that we reduce the number of state representatives from 151 to 108. That would be 3 state representatives per each Senate state district. And also to adopt lean practices that are currently adopted in the private sector, and bring them into play in Hartford, up at the Capitol, specifically at the House of Representatives. Again, I think these are major changes. I have no illusion that this is easy to do, but I've already talked to some of my colleagues up in Hartford, and I'm already receiving some support to at least discuss these areas. And I think if we can begin to demonstrate efficiencies in our own General Assembly, I think we can go ahead and then tackle some of the larger issues with the rest of the state government.
Mr. France, would you like to respond to any of that or additional comment?
Well, the only thing that I would respond to that is it's interesting that Mr. Bowles represents the Moore Commission, and they have proposed a number of things, but there's not been any legislation that's changed anything. I think it's great that you've reduced within the state from 15 COGS to 9. The challenge is that what gets proposed by government, government's proposed to form task forces, form commissions, and you never hear what they report out on most of the time because the reports don't come out on time, if they come out at all. You know, there are several task forces that have been formed in the last 2 years that haven't published anything related to the work that they were supposed to do. So while I think it's great to have great ideas and form commissions that give the appearance of doing work, the reality is you need to put the rubber to the road and actually put legislation on the table. And that hasn't been done in many cases for commissions and task forces that have been formed to look at very important issues. I think we need to do a better job of that and really hold the legislature accountable for the task forces and follow up on those.
Representative Bowles, on that point, in April 2013, you announced the formation of a task force to explore creation of a clean energy center at Norwich Hospital. We're now more than a year away. Haven't heard too much. Is that task force being effective, and might we see some progress there?
Yes, I certainly hope so. First of all, I'd like to respond to Mr. France's comments relative to the Moore Commission. We, in fact, have very heavy documentation, very robust documentation, at least in terms of the Regional Entities Working Group. We, again, have concentrated on 3 areas: transportation, human services, and back office functions. Through the Speaker's office and through the Governor's office, I was able to secure $2.3 million to go ahead and offer the opportunity for each of the 169 local municipalities in the state to tie into the Nutmeg Network, to take advantage of IT, information technology, and the Capital Region in particular has really established a model for going ahead and taking advantage of that. Likewise, with the Regional Human Services, that is in fact legislation. So effective, again, January 2015, by law, by statute, by a bill that I proposed, we will have state agencies, 8 major state agencies, including the Department of Education, DCF, a number of the other human service agencies, together with local chief elected officials and other stakeholders, that is, family advocates around a whole host of issues, to provide a much more integrated, much more decentralized delivery of human services. Relative to the Clean Energy Task Force, we had a lot of traction at the beginning. One of the things I had proposed on the Preston Riverwalk site was a research and development center, and that was a key element of this. Subsequently, and I have to give some credit to Don Williams, Senator Williams, for kind of stealing that idea a number of years ago, and the University of Connecticut, Dr. Choi is the provost and Susan Herbst is president. I've had some very in-depth discussions with them relative to going and taking advantage of them up at the Mansfield site, where they are working in a private-public enterprise around new clean energy technologies. And what I'm proposing now, and what we want to do, and what I'm specifying in my platform, is revitalizing the Clean Energy Task Force to go ahead and take advantage of the Yukon work up at the Mansfield site as an incubator for new technologies, specifically around solar and fuel cells, and to be able to identify sites here in southeastern Connecticut. Ideally, perhaps the Preston Riverwalk would provide such a site for the manufacturing of new green technologies as they're ready to market, as they get developed up at Yukon. And I think we have a distinct prospect of going ahead and doing that. So my interest is in going ahead and doing that, and continue to working with stakeholders throughout the district and throughout the delegation Southeastern Connecticut to go ahead and advance that. Manufacturing jobs, I think, are key in terms of our economic boost in terms of the whole economy down here. Thank you.
Mr. Bowles, anything else? Or we're going to move to our second question? I want to bounce that around pretty good. Representative Bowles, a question from the audience. Find the right one. Oh, the Democrats passed the Democratic majority passed the biggest tax increase in state history. So why should we elect you, a Democrat, and maintain that Democratic majority in the legislature? Representative Bowles.
That's an excellent question. Fortunately, I have to say that tax increase was passed in 2011. So I'm very able and truthfully so to say that I had no part in terms of the major tax increases that were part of Governor Malloy's response to the deficit he inherited from previous Republican administrations. I've worked for 6 different governors going back to El Grasso over my career as a state employee and as a policy person in the Office of Policy Management and other areas. Served as a selectman here in Preston for a couple of terms. So I do not, take any responsibility for those tax increases. I do believe, and again, that's why I'm talking about streamlining our legislative process. I'm calling for consideration of actually consolidating the human service agencies into one Department of Health and Human Services. I think there are ways that we can make ourselves much more efficient as state government, and I entirely agree with that. So I think we need to concentrate on efficiency within state government, beginning with the General Assembly, and then transfer that and continue our work in terms of of diminishing the regulatory process and making it much more streamlined for businesses, et cetera, and then also to go ahead and really take a hard look at the way our agencies are operating. We have been successful regarding some agencies, Department of Administrative Services specifically, to go ahead and really, again, incorporate the lean practices in their day-to-day operations. But the one thing that I think is very important, and I've worked very hard in the last two sessions, is that my immediate concern in the last two budgets, my votes had to do with holding local communities harmless relative to tax increases. And we were successful in doing that. We have not shifted the burden of our tax structure from Hartford and imposed it back on local municipalities. And a lot of that comes from my experience working on town budgets here in Preston. And I think it's critical that we continue that position. Thank you.
Mr. France, your opponent pointed out he wasn't there when they passed the tax increase. You've criticized it, so your reaction, your comment.
Well, I find it interesting. It is true he did not take the actual vote. However, he did vote in favor of the budget that succeeded that, which did include that tax increase. It also included over $1.5 billion of borrowing for current expenses. So while he did not vote, and it is fact that he did not vote for the actual tax increase, he did vote for the follow-on budget that included the revenue from that tax increase and did not speak out against it in any meaningful way to decrease the cost of state government. So by his vote for the budget this year, I would say that he voted in favor of a tax increase because he voted in favor of that revenue. I agree with lean, man. I've dealt with lean in the military. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in government from lean practices. I think that is one thing that we agree on. The challenge really is in implementation. I think that what we see from the Green Energy Task Force that Mr. Bowles, with a lot of fanfare, 16 months ago announced, as far as I can tell, they haven't met. And when I talk to people that are members of that task force from the beginning, they say they don't support it anymore. So I question the follow-through. I mean, there's a lot of great ideas out there, but when it comes to actually action on those ideas, where is Southeastern Connecticut drawing a benefit from them? I think that is really what the issue is. We can talk about getting green jobs. We can talk about light manufacturing. In our last race, Mr. Bowles changed his position twice on what he was going to do with the Preston Riverwalk. You know, first it was light manufacturing at the site, and by the end it was somewhere in Southeastern Connecticut. So I think that one of the things that we need to do is we need to hold our elected officials accountable for their positions and come back to them and say, how have you done? What have you done? This is what you said you were going to do, and did you do it, and why not?
Before we give Representative Bowles a chance to respond, can we kind of do the math? And so that's your time. And all right, so looks like you have a few more minutes on your opponent there, Mr. France. Any response to what you just heard, Representative Bowles?
Yeah, the fact of the matter is, in terms of accomplishments, one of the things that I'm most pleased about, and this took a lot of teamwork, working with the First Selectman here in Preston, working with the Preston Redevelopment Agency, working with my colleague, Senator Andy Maynard, and the rest of the delegation, working with the governor's office, is we were able to secure $5 million to go ahead and finish the cleanup of the Preston Riverwalk site. That is a priority for me. And upon election, it became very clear to me that had to continue to be. We were successful in going ahead and getting that $5 million grant, working again in concert with the PRA and with the Selectman's Office and other stakeholders in the area to go ahead and secure that grant. If any of you are driving by Route 12 now, you will be beginning to see the demolition and abatement of the Kettle building sitting there on Route 12. I believe approximately, and I know Sean Nugent here is present, but I believe about 80% of that campus will be cleaned up sometime by the beginning of the year. My commitment is, before we do anything else, is to go ahead and get that site shovel ready. The fact of the matter is, I've never changed my mind in terms of potential uses for the Preston redevelopment site, for the Preston Riverwalk site. What I have done is defer to the PRA and to the town of Preston, the residents, taxpayers, et cetera, in terms of of respecting the comprehensive management plan that's been developed through a lot of local input relative to that site, and I absolutely support that. That comprehensive management plan, which is available to anybody, it very clearly states that there are parcels, parcel 3 in particular, is ripe for manufacturing. So I want to be respectful about the process that we're engaged in, and will continue to be so. Thank you.
Anything more, Mr. France? The next question is yours. If not, one of our audience members wants to hear what would be the top 3 priorities of our candidates, if elected, to try to get the economy moving and generate jobs. Top 3 priorities for economic development. It starts with Mr. France.
Well, the first priority is to get a balanced budget. We've not seen that in several years. And why is that important? Well, because the budget has not been balanced, the small businesses cannot plan. Each year we've had new fees, increased taxes, and really a regulatory environment where businesses cannot plan year to year. We've had changes every year in both those fields. So if you look at a business that wants to start up and they need capital, they go to a bank, you got to put together a 5-year plan. How do you put that together when the state is changing the rules every year? You really can't. I've talked to 3 small business owners that made it through the beginning of the recession, and the first time they hit the new regulation that the state said you have to provide this whatever benefit that the state decides, not to keep their employees working for them, not to further their business, but just to take money out of their pocket. Not only do they have to hire that next employee, but then they have to pay all their employees whatever that benefit the state decided. That is getting in the way of small business. That is getting in the way of job growth. The state should not be doing that. They really need to get out of the way and not be in the way of the small businesses hiring people. I think the second thing that we really need to do is be more accountable for our roads and bridges in the state. The legislature has historically taken money out of the transportation fund and used it for other things it was not designated for. And so in place of that, you hear people talking about bringing back tolls. You hear about increasing the gas tax again. My position on that is until you bring all the money that's supposed to be used for infrastructure, for our roads and bridges, and use it appropriately, we don't need to give the state legislature any more money to go spend on other things. They've demonstrated a likelihood that if you do give them more money, they will use it for something else, not what it's designated for. It's one of the challenges with having a general fund. The money moves in there, but it is not accounted for with specificity to be able to understand where that money goes on a routine basis. So that is one of the things that I think is important. We spend money that it comes in, it's designated for a specific instance. The same thing we do in our towns. We receive grant money that's designated for a specific use. We have to use it that way. The state should abide by those same rules.
And remind you, the question is looking for your top 3 priorities, try to get the economy moving and create jobs.
Okay, again, I feel very strongly, I've already alluded to this, is that we need to go ahead and begin with the way state government operates, both in the legislative and executive branch, both in the General Assembly and with, again, our state agencies. I think we need to do a much better job in making government much more responsive, much more accountable, and much more efficient. So that's the first thing. I think we need to set an example as we move forward. I also believe that a critical piece of this is to go ahead. We need manufacturing jobs here in Southeastern Connecticut. I would love to see them at Preston Riverwalk, but we have other sites available to us as well. Montville, I know we've talked about this. I've worked with the mayor down there in regards to this. But with the casino industry falling short in terms of their revenues, with Pfizer continuing to downsize, we do have a stable element with EB, but we cannot count on that alone. We need another major economic driver here. Manufacturing, I think, is a key thing to get highly skilled, good paid jobs here in Southeastern Connecticut. That is a huge priority for me. Then getting down to so that's state government, the manufacturing sector, then I would like to get a little bit more specific. One of the things that I think we can do here in Eastern Connecticut is take advantage of the new designation that has been passed just within the last year that I voted for and supported together with my colleagues in the Southeast delegation is a designation of the harbor between New London and Groton as the Thames River Heritage Corridor. What I am talking about and what I'm proposing and what I will introduce as a bill, for next session is the idea of extending that designation. That is the Thames River Heritage Corridor, which takes advantage of the historical and cultural offerings and tourism offerings down in the New London Groton area. Extend that all the way up to the Preston Riverwalk, Mohegan Sun area, and then all the way up to the Norwich Harbor. I think it's critical, and I've said this before, I've met with Mayor Hinchy, is that what's good for Norwich is good for us. I think if we can take that heritage corridor concept and create a real viable corridor from the mouth of the Thames River all the way up to Norwich Harbor, then we also tie into the last Green Valley, which is a national heritage corridor that extends all the way from the harbor in Norwich all the way to the headwaters of the Quinnebog River up in Sturbridge Village. So we can, if we want to create an economic, environmental, cultural, and historical corridor that can really drive our economy, take advantage of all the attributes we have here in Eastern Connecticut. I think that would be an excellent way of going ahead and promoting this region and really taking a look at creating some economic viability here throughout Eastern Connecticut. Thank you.
Mr. France, you want to respond at all to what you heard here?
I think the only thing that I would respond to, I think those are all great ideas. I think that manufacturing is needed in Southeastern Connecticut. We do need to have businesses here. The challenge is, unless you get the budget and the fiscal house of the state in order, you are never going to see that. It is too expensive to do business in this state. If you don't stop growing government to the cost of government, you will never see manufacturing in Southeastern Connecticut. You must produce a balanced budget without increasing tax revenue. Demonstrate to business that you are not going to keep balancing the books on their backs. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see the exodus of businesses from this state. That's what we have witnessed. And that is the reality of not getting our fiscal house in order. So while I agree with Mr. Bowles at all the points that he's making about manufacturing and jobs and the Green Corridor and all those things, none of it will come to pass if we don't get our fiscal house in order.
Next question, Representative Bowles. The questioner points out that taxes on gasoline are so high in Connecticut that many drivers in this area choose to buy gasoline in adjacent states. And they ask, why not reduce the gas tax and draw people to Connecticut rather than driving them to other states to purchase gasoline and other merchandise? And it begins with Representative Bowles.
I entirely agree with that concept from the standpoint that I think the gas tax and the price of energy in general, beginning with gasoline, but taking a look at the doubling of our natural gas costs here in the state of Connecticut over the last couple of years, our energy costs in general are just high. I also agree with Mr. France on this particular issue is we have not done a good job in making sure that the funds generated by the gas tax have been specifically safeguarded and dedicated to our infrastructure, particularly the I-95 and I-84 corridor. Until we address the infrastructure issues on those two major highway systems, we continue to face a lot of congestion, which is not good. So again, we have to do something about our energy costs, including gasoline taxes, et cetera. But the one thing I do want to point out is that it's necessary for us to step back and take a comprehensive look at our whole tax structure, including property taxes, including the gas tax, including revenues and expenditures. As of this week, there is a new task force up in Hartford comprised of bipartisan, Republican, Democrats, business people, accountants, that are meeting to go ahead and develop a comprehensive review of our tax structure, which really hasn't been taken a look at in the last 30 years. It's time to go ahead and do that. We cannot take these pieces alone. We have to do a comprehensive, integrated look. One of the proposals from one of the gentlemen here in this audience is to take a look at people over the age of 75. Maybe we should start taking a look at giving them a break in terms of the taxes around this. But again, it has to be part of a complete, comprehensive approach to our whole revenue and tax and spending structure in the state.
And Mr. France, the questioner concerned about the high gas taxes and the fact that it's driving people to buy their gas in other states and other merchandise along with it.
And that is a real concern, and it is true. You can go to Rhode Island, you go to Massachusetts, buy gas 20 cents a gallon cheaper. So if you live close enough to the border, it pays to go across the border. The challenge is, how do you replace the revenue? And I agree with Mr. Bowles. I think we need to do a comprehensive look at how we bring revenue in. One of the examples that was given this past legislative cycle was two neighboring towns that the mill rate is 3 times as much. You live on one side of the street, you pay a car tax for the same vehicle, it's 3 times as much. I think that is an issue that needs to be resolved. Where I come from in California, the state collects the property tax on vehicles, so it's one fee for everybody. The challenge with what was proposed in the last legislative cycle on that particular issue was, how do you make the towns whole? In Ledyard, that's almost $2 million in lost revenue if you take away the vehicle tax from the towns and put it at the state level. The proposal at the time was to have it at the highest rate across the state and then slowly lower it over time to where it becomes a median and generates the same revenue. If that was the case and that was put forward for Ledyard residents, that would be an increase 3 times the tax rate. It's the highest tax rate, and this mill rate was almost 75 mil. So I think that there's a room for looking at how we generate revenue. One of the issues that towns have is the only way they can generate revenue is through the property tax. We are the state with the highest dependency on that, and it does affect the people in the state negatively. One of the things I think that is why you're seeing, and what I hear when I knock on doors, retirees leaving the state. There are too many other options out there to go to a state where there is no tax, or a very low tax, a very low cost of living. Why do we see retirees move to Florida? It isn't just for the weather. You can live down there very efficiently, very cost effectively on many fewer dollars. I think that is what we need to look at. Certainly looking at age 75 and above, there are other states at age 65. They do away with the property tax. Another way that would be a challenging thing for towns, so maybe we just hold it flat. You stop the increase of property tax at 65. That way at least retirees can plan. They can know what their expenses are going to be. The challenge right now with retirees at 65 and they retire on a fixed income, they don't know what next year is going to happen. What is the town going to do? Are they going to increase the mill rate? In my own town, it was a 6% increase last year. It was significant. And I hear it from a lot of people. It's $400, $500 a year. That might not sound like a lot of money to people who are working, but retirees, that's a lot of money. So I think that is one thing that we do need to look at and certainly figure out how to better generate revenue that's going to feed our state. But we don't need to generate more revenue. We need to reduce the cost of state government. We have a cost of state government that our residents cannot afford. And we're seeing that in the exodus of our people leaving the state and going to other states. That is the real root cause, example of what's going on in our state. We need to be responsive to that.
Mr. France, while you're on the point, I think you got a little more time, so take the opportunity. Could you elaborate where, you keep talking about cutting the cost of government, could you elaborate where you would cut, maybe what programs, departments we live without, what some ideas you might bring to the table if elected?
The approach I would take is the same thing I took in my own town. When I became the chair of finance, I didn't know what was in the town budget, so I had to get into it and look at what's in the budget and where we're spending money. I think one of the things that is ripe for efficiencies that even Mr. Bowles has acknowledged is the management structure in our state government. It is still living in a business structure that is from the 60s and 70s with multiple layers of management. Business changed back in the 80s. They could not afford to maintain 6, 7, 8 levels of management. So they went very flat, 3, 4 levels, the worker, the supervisor, management. In many companies, that's the way they went. Unfortunately, state governments and federal governments, all governments, have no profit motive. There's nothing preventing them from increasing the cost. And why is that? Because all they'd have to turn around is raise taxes. And we have no choice but to pay them or leave the state. And so we are really left with very little choice. And so that is really, I think, where a lot of efficiency can come, a lot of reduced cost, is in reducing the management structure of our state government. As far as specific departments, I think it goes back to efficiencies. I think there are more efficient ways to deliver services. One of the challenges is when you come into but without knowing the details and being able to sit down with department heads like I did in my own town to understand, what do you do? Why do you need that money? Look back historically at their actual expenditures. We found that there were departments that had $10,000 budgets that never spent more than $4,000. So why do you need $10,000? And they'd all go, well, I might need X, Y, and Z. Well, no, you don't get X, Y, and Z. That's how you really look at what the efficiencies are in a government structure. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're going to end up with the same process you have today. A continually growing government, a continually increasing cost, and as I said, the residents can no longer afford the size of government that we have. And we need to stop the growth.
Thank you. Might be a good time to check our time and let the candidates know. Okay, a little under 9 minutes, Representative, and 11 minutes left for Mr. France. The next question, and maybe this one will allow brief answers, and it first goes to Representative Bowles. What is your position on the ballot question to amend the Connecticut Constitution, which I understand would give the state some flexibility to move beyond same-day voting and make other changes to how we vote? So starting with Representative Bowles, the question is looking for your position on whether that should be approved or not.
Absolutely support it. I think we have a great Secretary of State in Denise Merrill. It's very alarming to me as we take a look across the country. Very recently in Ohio, they have disallowed or held in abeyance early voting in Ohio, and we take a look at some of the things that are happening down south and in Texas and other states where they are actually diminishing voters' rights in terms of their access to going ahead and being able to go ahead and vote. It's a disenfranchisement that I think is incredibly not only discouraging, but very dangerous. So I give a lot of credit to Denise Merrill and her department for successfully getting this as a constitutional question that all of you will have the opportunity November 4th to vote on, to go ahead and allow greater flexibility around things like early voting. I think it's critical for us, and this is a fundamental right that we all have, and I feel even beyond that, an obligation that we have. It's distressing to me to see turnouts as low as 30% of the electorate in a lot of our general elections. So anything that we can do to make voting much more accessible and much more convenient for folks, I am absolutely supportive of. Thank you.
And Mr. France, your views on the proposed constitutional amendment?
I honestly have not seen the proposal, but I'll talk to the question, so I don't know what's specifically in the amendment. But I think the issue related to voting rights and access to voting, absentee voting is very restrictive in this state. If you go by the letter of the law, you must have almost a doctor's excuse that you're not going to be in town on the day of voting. I'm not certain why that is. Where I come from in California, if you have a legitimate reason where you have to work or you want to vote early via absentee ballot, there is not a regulation against that. I'm not certain why we have that kind of restriction. I think that the other thing that I would recommend as far as the whole process related to voting and is an initiative process, initiative and referendum process. Once again, in California, they've had that for over 40 years. It does give the voice of the public to be able to bring forward initiatives. You have to get a certain number of signatures to support validity of that, but then it goes on the ballot and it gets voted on. And even after that has happened, and many times that's because the public gets frustrated with the legislature. They're not doing what they want them to do, whether that's because of protracted issues between the two parties or for other reasons. But it gives the public the right and the ability to put something forward on a ballot and then get the vote of the public. And even after that, it can still be brought through the judiciary to be decided on whether there are constitutional issues. So there is a hedge against that, and we've seen that in initiatives in California where they've been voted on and approved by the public, but then it goes before the courts and they determine it's unconstitutional. So I think that is one thing that gives greater access to individuals across the state to influence the direction of their state. And if they see an activity in the legislature, it does give them the ability, instead of just having to work through their one representative, to have a grassroots effort to change the direction of their state.
Representative Bowles, Mr. France had a wrinkle with his support for direct ballot initiatives. I don't know if you wanted to comment and say whether you support that concept or not.
I think I'll just simply say that it's worthy of taking a look at, and I would support researching that a little bit further.
All right, next question goes to Mr. France, and it's how would you support the Norwich State Hospital? How important is it to the region and to the state that we see development there?
I think that it is important across the region to have development. The one benefit the Norwich State Hospital property has, it already has infrastructure there. You have sewer, you have water. There aren't very many places in Southeastern Connecticut that are essentially ready to build. I think that is important. Once again, though, unless you're willing to give away benefits either at the town level or at the state level, you need to get a predictable future for business if you're going to bring manufacturing or any other kind of business onto that property. The only way that we have been able to in recent years to overcome the high cost to business is to pay companies to come here. Jackson Labs was the most recent case, over $300 million. Yes, they're going to bring jobs, but we had to give a very high cost in order to get them here. And that's to overcome the high cost of doing business in this state. The high cost of energy, high cost of gas, that's a part of it. But the regulation, the business entity tax, just to exist, I got to pay $250 every 2 years. Why? Because the state needs money. It doesn't do anything for the business. They don't advertise for it. They don't market the business. It's just money you have to give to the state, whether you make a profit or not, just to be in business. Why? There's no reason for it, except the state needs money, and they find new and creative ways to do that. Over the past 3 years, they've created new taxes, new fees. We started taxing services that we never taxed before. Hair salons, nail salons now have a 10% excise tax. You looked at the fees for professionals, plumbers, electricians. They doubled the licensing fee. Real estate agents, hunting licenses, they doubled it. Why? Because the state needed money, and they didn't want to raise income tax or sales tax. Why? Because it would be on the front page of the day, above the fold, and the bulletin the next day, and the constituents would be screaming at their legislature. Instead, you find out when you go renew your license, well after the legislation is passed. That's not the way you do business in an upfront way.
And Representative Bowles, just to go back to the question, it was about the Norwich State Hospital. How important is it to see development there for the town, state, and the region?
I think it's absolutely critical. The first thing I want to say, and I have been educated on this matter, is that I would like to get away from using the term the old Norwich State Hospital property. I think that's in concurrence with the remarkable work that our volunteers on the Preston Redevelopment Agency has done. It's no longer AKA Norwich State Hospital. I started my state career there again in 1980. It is Preston Riverwalk, and I think it's essential for us to get that in our minds, collectively as a community, as a district, as residents and taxpayers in Southeastern Connecticut, to refer to that particular site. It's in Preston. It's not in Norwich. It's Preston. And by consensus of the local community, we're calling it the Preston Redevelopment, or the Preston Riverwalk. I think it's critical. It has been named a priority by our Council of Governments. Again, Republicans and Democrats alike have recognized that the utilization and development of that particular site, given its location off of 395, it's between Boston and New York. There are a whole host of attributes associated with that beautiful parcel, 390 acres, at least on the Preston side, that I think it's imperative that we go ahead, and I think it's critical that we do that. I am again very pleased that we were able to secure $5 million and other funds, thanks to the work of the PRA, to really clean up that site. I think that remains a priority for me, and to make it shovel ready. So I'm committed to continue working with the PRA, with the Council of Governments, and with the economic development folks here in Southeastern Connecticut, the Chamber, et cetera, in making sure that site gets developed to the benefit of all of us.
The next question goes to Representative Bowles, but it's being asked to both candidates. The question is, and we actually got a couple of questions on this, did you or do you support the gun law that was passed in the wake of the Newtown shooting, or should it be repealed? Short of repeal, what changes, if any, would you propose to the gun law? And first crack at that is Representative Bowles. And maybe before he answers, one more look at the time here, see how we're doing. Okay, and Representative Bowles.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a matter of record that I voted against the gun bill. I did not make that decision until about 4 days prior to the vote. I went to the Chief of Staff of my caucus and told her, based on conversations that I had with friends and neighbors and folks here in Southeastern Connecticut in my district. I had a cup of coffee with a gentleman, a gun collector down at Valentino's in Ledyard. My wife and I have a couple of 100 acres up in Preston that we, just down the road here, that I allow, always have hunters on there, a couple of hunters a year, just in terms of deer management. And I think more importantly than anything else, I was convinced the morning of Sandy Hook, I was down in New London as a legislator. I was actually the only legislator except for Kevin Ryan, actually. Representative Ryan was there with me that morning with a host of providers and, more importantly, family members of youngsters that were on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum. And one by one, they stood up that morning as the events of Sandy Hook were unfolding that morning and speaking about the fear they had, number one, of their children. That they could see that there was, something was going on with their kids that they were dealing with. And then their other fear was, as they get older, many of these parents, their children were, in the late teens, early 20s, what's going to happen to them as they age out, are no longer capable of taking care of them. I went from that meeting that morning up to the Department of Children and Families regional office right down here in Norwich, across from the Shannon in the Shannon building. Met with Alan Kalisher, the regional administrator, in my capacity as a liaison to the Southeast Mental Health System of Care, which I did for about 4 years. I worked very hard in behavioral health issues with youth and young adults for a number of years. My wife and I spent some time as therapeutic foster parents with a couple of adolescents, where I saw that mental health issues were the prevalent issue that went on in Sandy Hook with Adam Lanza. And you can take Adam Lanza and multiply him across this state and across this country by many-fold. So again, it was really with the constituents, and that's what I feel I'm obligated to do. I need to listen and to respond to my constituents on these kinds of issues. It was a difficult vote. I spent, time up at the Capitol at midnight with parents of the Sandy Hook victims, and I cried with them. Actually, still emotional. It was a very, very difficult thing, to hug them and cry with them. But I stand by that vote. I would not be supportive of a repeal. I do think at some point in time it may be appropriate to revisit it and make amendments, particularly around ammunition registration and the loopholes in terms of out-of-state purchases.
Mr. France, your turn.
If I had been in the legislature, I would not have voted for the bill, and I do support repeal. I think that the restrictions on gun ownership that are in that bill do not follow the Second Amendment, nor do they follow, more importantly, our own Constitution. Our own Constitution is much more clear on gun ownership. The citizen shall have the right to own arms for defense of himself or the state, period. Too many people get caught up in the Second Amendment with the militia and all the other things that are related to that, but our state constitution is very clear. The areas where I think that the bill went into, mental health and school security, I think are important, but I think they need to be dealt with as individual bills. The school security bill, a portion of that, provided funding, but I think it didn't go far enough. I think that there are things that we need to continue to look at for additional measures across the state. I think that the mental health aspect of it, once again, they formed a task force. It was supposed to report out in February of this year. It still hasn't reported out. You know, we are very good as a government, at any government level, of forming task forces and commissions that do nothing. Or if they do file a report, it gets put on a shelf. When I was in grad school, I worked at the town of Willimantic, and they had many reports that they had paid good money for from consultants to go, and they could put it on a shelf. They don't do it. We need action, not more studies. So I think that is one thing that we need to go back to and revisit. You know, we went and put guns in the bill that we outlawed because they look scary, not because of what they shoot. I can make an AR-15-like weapon that shoots BBs, but we didn't do that. They looked scary. They scared people. The reality is, if I have 3 intruders coming into my house, each of them armed, and you're going to tell me I can only have a magazine with 10 shots in it, in the middle of the night I'm going to wake up and I'm going to take down 3 armed intruders? Now, is that likely in this area? No. But is it possible in Hartford, in New Haven, in Bridgeport? Maybe. And we have to remember, we're not creating law for the 42nd District. We're creating law for the entire state. We cannot look at just our own area when we create law that affects the entire state. And we cannot take our own standing here of relative safety and very low murder rate and create law that puts others in jeopardy and is a violation of our rights.
And next question goes to Mr. France. One of the more controversial pieces of legislation in the last couple of sessions was the assisted suicide bill, also known by its supporters as aid in dying legislation. And the questioner would like to know where the candidates stand on that if it was to come up again in the next session and they were in the legislature. And start with Mr. France.
On this issue, I'm very much a libertarian. I don't believe that the government should be involved in sanctioning end of life. I wasn't aware of the legislation at all until I went to my interview with the Orange Bulletin, and I've taken time since that time to read the legislation that was not passed, but was proposed in 2013, and again the revised legislation in 2014. I was told there were significant changes and significant safeguards added in between. The reality is all they did was add a 2-week waiting period. You had to give a letter and then give a second letter 15 days later. And you had to get a diagnosis from 2 doctors, which was consistent with the original legislation. But are we really solving a problem that exists? If you listen to the CEO from the Connecticut Hospice Incorporated, he, during his testimony, stated that he had 1,200 to 1,400 admissions a year in his 7 years of his tenure. So we're talking between 8,000 and 10,000 people coming into hospice. There were 4 people that talked about end of life. We're not even talking about a decimal point of a percentage. Once again, this is an issue where the legislation is passing a law to solve a problem that doesn't exist because it's emotional. Certainly we've all heard of Dr. Kevorkian many years ago, but this is not an issue that's a problem for our state. It really is not. And we're trying to solve something that doesn't exist as a problem. We should be focused on the real issues that affect this state: the economy, jobs, restoring the state to a place where people can stay and live. We don't have families leaving. We don't have retirees leaving after they lived here their entire life.
Representative Bowles?
Yes, thank you for that question. This is a very emotionally charged issue, but I have to be on the record of saying that I am against that particular proposed legislation, even though there were improvements made this past session. I have a lot of respect for Representative Betsy Ritter, who is a real champion for this. But my experience, and again, I have to talk about my own faith as a Christian in terms of approaching issues such as this. I think there are a couple of things relative to this. First of all, I think the danger here is that we're compromising the medical community in terms of giving them some jurisdiction over this issue, of asking them to take part in assisted suicide. And I have some real deep concerns about that, going back to the basic Hippocratic Oath. So that's one of the concerns I have on that. The other one is my own experience with my mother, who passed away with ovarian cancer about 4.5 years ago now, and saw her out in California go through some tremendous pain, in her last couple of years of life. Very, very brave. Very strong. But we had hospice out in California for her, very effective, to the point that my 89-year-old father in California is a volunteer now for hospice in the greater San Francisco area and works specifically with World War II vets. And I just feel that, and I've taken a tour of the facility in Norwich, I think it's a very effective alternative in terms of pain management and end-of-life issues. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think there's just a little bit time left in the debate and hardly any time for you, Representative Bowles, just to be aware. Maybe we could hold it up now. We're going to have to go to closing statements anyway. Okay. Yeah, Mike, the next question goes to you, and the question wants to know, can you point out any issue which you disagree with your party? Maybe looking for something where you maybe disagree with the Republican point of view, and that starts with Mike France.
That's an interesting question. I think it is a matter of degree. I think that the issues across the party don't measure each individual, and I think there's a lot of variance among both parties, individuals in those parties. I'm not real familiar with the national party platform. I don't really follow the national party platform, so I couldn't talk to a specific issue. What I try and do is approach matters I have my entire life as a naval officer, as an engineer. I look at the problem, I research the problem, I talk to people that are experts in the field, and then I find out what the root cause of the problem is and fix that root cause. I don't get distracted by the shiny objects along the way. I fix the problem. And then you measure the problem. Did it get fixed? And if it didn't work, you take it out and you start over again. So I think I really don't know a specific issue that the party has, because once again, I don't follow the national platform, and it's not how I approach my political life. It's not how I approach my life in general. I really look at the individuals and try and determine what they believe and what they don't believe and what they've done by their actions, and make a decision that way.
All right, and Representative Bowles, it looks like you have a little over 20 seconds to say what, if there's anything you disagree with, then we're going to be moving to closing statements. Representative Bowles.
We'll talk quick here. One key area that I am absolutely in disagreement with this administration and went to battle with them the last couple of years has to do with our energy policies. We are far too reliant on importing or theoretically importing energy from Hydro-Quebec all the way up in Canada, building transmission lines through New Hampshire. I keep saying environmentalists up in New Hampshire are not only NIMBYs, but they carry guns. So I think that's going to be a difficult stretch to build transmission lines through the White Mountains. We also spent $230 million on Maine wind. I think we can do a better job here in state in developing renewable energy and energy.
Time is up. Okay. Now we go to closing statements. And I'll ask you if you could keep your seats after we hear closing statements. Judy Dolphin, the president of the League of Women Voters, wanted to briefly address people about the amendment you'll be voting on to the Constitution. But before we do that, each candidate has 1 minute, and we're going to begin with Mr. France and then move on to Representative Bowles.
Once again, I would like to thank you all for being here tonight and the day, Eastern Connecticut Chamber of Commerce, and League of Women Voters, for putting on this debate. It's been a great opportunity for the voters of the 42nd District to hear directly from the candidates. My last 2 tours in the Navy were in Maine and Connecticut. Over that 7 years, I fell in love with New England, which actually surprised me because I grew up in Southern California in warmer climates, but I grew to love the 4 seasons. When I retired from the Navy, I bought a house in Gales Ferry and started getting involved in the local community. It has been a great place for my children to enjoy their teenage years, and I want them to be able to return when they graduate from college, find a job, and enjoy our great state. That's why I'm running for state representative. We need to send common sense leaders to the state legislature who understand that consistent fiscal policy and balanced budgets are the key to sustainable economic growth. I'm asking for your vote on November 4th to serve as your state representative. Thank you very much.
And Representative Bowles?
Again, thank you all. I see a lot of friends and neighbors here. Appreciate you coming out this evening. My dear wife, I appreciate her being by my side throughout this. The one thing I want to say in closing is, first of all, I have a lot of respect. I indicated this, Mr. France, prior to the debate. A lot of respect for him stepping forward and running again this election. Thus far, to the last election and so far this election, I think we have been able to go ahead and present our views. They differ philosophically, very different from each other, but I am committed to the idea of working in a bipartisan way, of really working to get rid of the divisiveness that's tearing apart this country, both nationally and in this state. I think we need to work hard, both parties, in finding common ground and really working for all of you as voters and as taxpayers to make this state better. And I think we can do that. So with your help and with your input, I hopefully will be able to continue my work up in Hartford. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. You've been a very good audience. Maybe a round of applause now for our candidates. Good discussion. And